All right, so the next project we have to do is we're gonna have to make the wheels for the cannon. And I wanted it to have kind of an old wagon wheel kind of look to it. So I need to make some rings that are pretty symmetrical. And the way I came up with to do it, I've done this a lot in the past, is to use my router. First, we're gonna start off with a square. These are 16 by 16. The finished size I want is around 14-inch diameter wheel. And what I did is I went from corner to corner, corner to corner, and just drew a line. Then I used my square to get a 90-degree across the same. All the points go through the same spot, so I know where dead center is. If I just take a regular drywall screw, I've got a piece of sacrificial plywood for my workbench. Now I've got this screwed down and it can't move. I have two pieces of 1/2-inch plywood. They're screwed together. I'm gonna take, so that these can't separate and slide separate, we're gonna put another screw there. Now they're locked, they can't move. As far as my router, this is just my little trim router. Gonna do little baby steps so we don't need a lot of router, and it's nice and light, a lot easier to move around. If I was doing a lot of these, or I was trying to do them more for finish work, and I'm not doing them for finish work, you'll see why a little bit later on, I would countersink these screws. And essentially what it is this is the foot that comes on the trim router. I took the screws out of it. I took a piece of 1/4-inch copolymer. Guys, this is just something I had laying around. It's just scrap stuff. You could use a piece of 1/4-inch Luan, 1/4-inch plywood, whatever you have. I like this because it's somewhat flexible, gives me a little bit of room to maneuver around. I drilled 4 holes to match and screwed the base on. Normally, I would countersink these screws down in there. I didn't this time because it's not going to make any difference, and it's just time right now. This is just a throwaway piece when I'm done. Now, for the math, I want a wheel that's 14 inches in diameter. So the radius for that is 7 inches, obviously. So what I did is I measured, this is my router bit right here, and what I did is measured from the inside edge of my router bit, because that's going to be the outside edge of the wheel, and I drilled a hole 7 inches. So there's a hole right here, 7 inches. How that correlates for us is we're going to take that center screw back out. Now you understand why we put that other screw in there. We're going to put this down and put our screw back through. We want it to be secure but not tight, because we're going to move this piece back and forth. Now, plug in our router, make sure our power's off. And how this works is we're just going to rotate this around, and every time we go around, we're going to drop the depth of the router just a little bit, and eventually we're going to wind up cutting out a perfect circle. Now, this outer piece, when we cut this circle, when we get through the first sheet of plywood, we're going to have this little piece that's going to want to move around on us. So what I did was take an extra drywall screw in each corner. Corner is waste, doesn't matter. Unless you can think of another use for it. We're going to start the router, and you'll see me start to make circles round and round, and we will cut out this circle, plunging it a little deeper each time. We'll take our center screw out. Now, I intentionally went down into my piece of sacrificial plywood. That'll play importantly later, but you'll see why I want that circle traced into there for us. If you see these two screws that we put over here in the corner, here's why we put those screws in there. If you didn't pick up, when we cut through that first piece, when this was loose, it would have caused all kinds of problems for us. Now, we have maybe a couple of picture frames. We have 2 perfectly cut circles here on the table. And what I want to do, so that I know the way these go back together, I want to take one of my lines here. I want to draw a line through both of these, and then when I undo this screw, I want to make sure that I mark both of these the same. So this one will be 1A, and this one will be 1B. I'm going to put them back together. Our indexing mark is still lined up. Put our screw back through here. Now, something a little different is going to happen. we're gonna cut a ring out of this, just like we cut that outer ring off. We're gonna cut a ring that's probably, we're gonna call it 2 inches. So, go back to our router over here. Let's unplug it for safety. And then let's unwind the cord because we made a bunch of turns. We made about 5 or 6 turns. So the cord's got about 5 or 6 twists in it. We're gonna run it all the way back out to about there. And then, last time we measured to the inside of the cutter. This time we're gonna measure to the outside of the cutter. Our radius was 7 inches, and we're gonna take 2 inches away from 7, which leaves us 5. So we wanna drill a hole from the outside of our cutter, 5 inches in, and we're gonna drill a hole. Now, for my particular instance here, this does not have to be exact. As long as these 2 pieces match each other, and I'm gonna do this twice, the holes are gonna be in the exact same spot, and these 2 pieces are gonna be conjoined together to make 1 wheel. As long as the wheels match, these 2 halves match each other, we're good to go. Realize that when we get this outer ring, when we cut through the first sheet of 1/2 inch plywood, this outer ring is going to be all loose and it's going to want to move around. So just like on this outer square we put 2 screws, we're going to put 2 screws in this outer ring, which is eventually going to be our wagon wheel. We'll start our router, plunge it in, we'll just continue until we cut this ring free. And there we have the outside of our wagon wheel. All right, we've got just one of our rings screwed down to the table here. Do you remember when we drew the cross and the X across that piece in the beginning to locate center? We're going to use those marks again. Now I've gone over them with a black Sharpie marker just to help the camera see it a little better because the pencil didn't show up real well. But we're going to route a groove where all of those spoke marks are. And essentially, this is a piece of a stainless round rod here. Stainless round rod is going to lay, and all those router marks to form are to a hub in the center, and that gives me a place to recess those down in there. So we changed our router bit to a V-ing bit. I just took a scrap piece of metal and adjusted my height to get my height right where I wanted it. Now all I'm going to do is run it across here and cut a bunch of grooves. We're going to do it freehand, nothing fancy. Do you remember this piece of wood that was out there that was our workbench? Just took a circular saw and I cut it off. And it's a rough cut. I'm not worried about the finish on it because all I'm interested in is this circle. This circle was left over when we cut the wagon wheel at a rim out with the router, and we're going to use that for a little fixturing, and I'll show you what I mean. Here's one of the pieces of our wheel, and we put a couple of screws in there to hold it on there. And remember, what I'm going to do is put those screws back in their original hole. And all these screws are going to do is just act to locate this in the right position so it can't move. This one I won't be able to drill in all the way, but it'll keep that from being able to move. Now, here's the hub, and that hub is turned to 1/4 inch to this little shoulder right here. And the reason I did that is it's 1/4 inch from the bottom of the V to the bottom of the piece of plywood. So, I'll take a bolt, put a bolt through there, put a bolt in the center, and a nut on the bottom. And here's what that's going to do. We're going to do some welding here in a minute, and I need a source to ground to. I take this ground clamp and hook it to the bottom of that bolt right there. Now, these are a bunch of pieces of stainless pencil rod. I took them in the lathe and I polished them up just a little bit. And then at one end I cut a little, I don't know if you can see it, a little notch. That notch has a purpose. We're going to weld all these in here. These are going to sit right in here. We're going to weld them all the way around, just like so. And that little notch, all that notch is for is to give the epoxy, because I'm going to epoxy these in, gives the epoxy something to bite to so it's not grabbing on a smooth piece of metal. What I want to do first is put just a series of small tack welds on each one of these to hold it in place, and then I'll come back in and I'll actually add some filler metal. We're going to hold the torch there and let it do its full post flow, which I think I have set to 10 or 15 seconds. This to not discolor the stainless. And I want to go to the exact opposite side and do the same thing again. All right, so we've got a rough setup of where our spokes need to go. That's pretty awesome. That's going to wind up going down there like that, and we're going to glue that together with epoxy and with carpenter's glue, and that'll make a nice solid wheel that won't go anywhere and still has a pretty nice look to it. All right, so these wheels have had the opportunity to sit up overnight. The epoxy and the carpenter's wood glues had a chance to harden. I spent a little time wood filling. I filled them all the screw holes, sanded everything nice and smooth. So we want to put a tire on this wagon wheel, just like the old wagon wheels had, so that when you roll it, that stones and chips in the ground and whatever don't wear away at the soft wood. And the way they typically would do that was with a piece of band iron, and they would make a tire for a wagon wheel. And it just so happens, digging through my pile of leftover material, I have a piece of 1-inch flat bar, and this is 3/16 stainless steel. It's a little bit left over. It's 1 inch wide, and it happens to be the right width, and I happen to have enough length. The way I calculated the length was took the diameter times pi, and I come up with 43.93 inches, I think. I just made it 44. And I had enough material to do it, and I actually have about, according to the math, about that much left over. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna bend this, and then I'll trim it to the exact length once we get it all clamped up in place. Now, if you've ever bent flat bar or bent any material, a lot of times bending out here around something is fairly easy. Where it gets a little difficult is that last little bit right at the end, is to get that bend the way you want it. So the way I've developed over time to help me get over that is to actually bend both ends first and then bend the center. Now we're going to over bend this. This is obviously a tighter diameter than this wheel, but it's a lot easier to push that diameter back down and straighten it out than it is to try to bend it down once it's attached to the wheel. We're going to use a C-clamp, and what we're going to do is we're going to clamp right at the very end of the piece. And that way, as we bend that piece first. Once we kind of start to get shape, what I did was loosened it and scooted it about halfway out and did it again. That way we try to force that radius in there. Now luckily we're over radiusing this, and that's good, because like I said, it's a lot easier to straighten that radius out than it is to try to do it when you're up in that tight confined area. Now, what we wound up with is this, which is smaller than this, but it easily pulls out. All right, so we started to wrap this around the wheel, and like I said, we intentionally left this one a little bit long, and all we're doing is just taking these woodworking clamps, just clamping this down, and what we're looking for here is to get a dimension to where we need to trim this to. And what I'm going to do is just take my marker, put a little tick mark there, grab my square so that I make sure I cut a nice straight line across the wheel, and it's square to the work, not square to the wheel. All right, so here's how we're gonna put this tire on this wagon wheel. First, we'll start off with our little bag of screws, and these are just little like 3/4 inch wood screws. And the first one's kind of the critical one, because what we want to do is get this wooden part centered in front of the metal part. And all we're doing is just working our way all the way around. So these little screws do a fine job of pulling that tire right to the surface there. All right, other than that one hole, it's all done. Now, we're gonna weld this right here. And normally this would be a very simple weld, not a big deal at all. However, a couple of things make this a real tricky weld. One, don't want any heat buildup because we're against wood. Wood is obviously flammable. Two, when wood begins to heat, it decomposes. When it decomposes, it gives off gases. Those gases don't do well with our weld puddle. So the way we can deal with the heat is I've got a couple of rags that are just folded up here, And all I'm gonna do is wrap these rags around the wheel right here. And these rags are real wet. They're very damp. And what that'll do is act like a heat sink. And as the heat tries to dissipate, it'll pull that heat very quickly away. Also, we can grab it as soon as we quit welding and put it on top of the weld and hopefully cool that weld down rapidly. Now, one of the things that's going to happen when we weld this is that it's going to give off some porosity. It's going to try to put little pinholes in our weld. That's because the wood is breaking down and releasing gases. And the only way to really go around that is to weld this ahead of time and then try to slip it onto the tire. But I got to be honest, this isn't a high stress weld. This thing's just going to roll back and forth, probably into some kind of storage box or whatever. Anyway, we're going to make a quick weld, and then once we're done welding, we're going to cool it down, take it over to the grinder and grind it. And not bad. Off to the grinder we go. We'll blend it all in. We'll have to just fix that one little screw hole, and we now have a wheel that's got a steel tire on it, wood, all of it stainless. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed what you saw here today. Be sure to subscribe to my channel and like us on Facebook. Please, somewhere down below here is a link. See you soon.